Hurricane Gustav is now moving inland after battering America's Gulf Coast and the city of New Orleans. It brought with it ferocious winds of more than 170 kilometers an hour and a 4-meter storm surge. Waves crashed over some of the protective levees surrounding New Orleans, which were breached by Hurricane Katrina 3 years ago. But the U.S. Army engineers say walls held and pumps were able to keep up with the flooding. President Bush has praised the swift emergency response. Gustav is now heading inland and has been downgraded to a Category 1 hurricane with 145 km/h winds. Matthew Price has this report.
The early winds of Hurricane Gustav swirled in just after daybreak. Within minutes, they were battering the Big Easy, lashing the streets with rain. In places, you could hear them howling down the avenues, and this was just the outer edge of the storm.
Well, these storm force winds are whipping in now into New Orleans. They are bringing with them driving rain, and they are starting to have an effect on the city itself. But it's not the damage caused by the winds that's going to be the big concern of the authorities here at the moment. What they'll be checking and looking for is whether or not the city's flood defences hold when the massive expected storm surge comes through.
And already some of the city's levees, the earth banks and walls that are meant to keep the water out, look precariously low. This is the city's weak spot. Many had heeded the warnings and left the city, but in the one bar that prides itself on never closing, we found them drinking their fears away.
I don't know, I might be crazy, I don't know. I just felt like this is still the safest part of the city.
The latest forecasts have Gustav heading to the west of New Orleans. It is not as strong as had at first been predicted, but it is still a force to be reckoned with.
It's very important for those who've been evacuated to listen very carefully to the officials in their respective states before they decide to return. This storm is yet to pass. It's a serious event.
As many as 2 million people across this region fled this storm. Some spent the night in public shelters, not knowing what is happening to their homes. So for now, New Orleans and the Gulf Coast wait and hope. This storm, at the moment, does not appear to be as bad as Hurricane Katrina. But exactly 3 years on from that disaster, these are anxious hours. Matthew Price, BBC News, New Orleans.
Well, on the line now from the city of Lafayette in Louisiana is our correspondent Gavin Hewitt. Gavin, you're about 30 miles inland, I believe, something like that, 50 kilometres maybe. How strong does the storm seem?
Yeah, a little bit less than that. I mean, Lafayette is close also to Baton Rouge, and the eye of the storm is passing overhead at the moment, the eye of the hurricane. The winds remain fierce, driving rain. The street, which I'm looking out on at the moment, you can hardly see anything of the street, and every so often there is a low rumble, which usually means there's a fierce gust. I think this particular area has been used to these storms before, but one of the questions that is being asked at the moment, people weren't evacuated from Baton Rouge and Lafayette. A lot of the town are still here, and this storm has really been battering these two places for the last 2 hours. And although something like 95% of the residents of New Orleans were evacuated, that isn't the case here. And I think one of the concerns will be that particularly if the floodwaters rise because of the intense rain, whether that's going to leave considerable problems for the people who stayed behind here.
And is the concern that as the storm continues, I realise that it's been downgraded, of course, but it depends what it hits in its path to a large extent, is the concern that it's going to create more damage as it moves into Texas?
Well, I think what happens with hurricanes, obviously as they touch land, they do weaken. But when you're very close to the coast, they can still do huge damage. And these coastal communities in Louisiana and also close by in Texas were hammered by not only Katrina but also by Rita, which struck shortly after. And as I say, I think the concern here is different from New Orleans. The concern there is still that somehow the levees may be weakened by this sort of over-slopping, if you like, that's going on at the moment. But here the concern is that there may well be floodwaters just from the intense rain. And the difference here between these two towns, Baton Rouge and Lafayette, is that the people on the whole stayed behind where I am at the moment. There are just lots and lots of people. And we have had driving rain for must have been the last 2-3 hours. And I don't think that was expected.
Gavin, thank you very much indeed.
Well, it didn't quite happen, did it? New Orleans has escaped a repeat of the horrors that followed Hurricane Katrina 3 years ago after the worst of Hurricane Gustav missed the city. An estimated 2 million people headed inland from the Louisiana coast to escape the storm. But in the end, the Big Easy was spared, the storm defences held, the levees didn't break. Well, despite losing strength, Gustav is not yet itself a spent force. It's crossing Louisiana and it's due to head through Texas over the next few days, dumping as much as ½ metre of rain onto what is normally an arid state. With more on New Orleans near miss, here's Matthew Price.
The rain is still falling. The debris needs clearing. But this is a city breathing a huge sigh of relief.
Well, considering the type of storm they were expecting, New Orleans has got off relatively free, but the National Guard are still out on the streets at the moment patrolling. People are being told that they cannot come back here until the mayor and the city decide it is safe to do so.
New Orleans took a battering, but Hurricane Gustav, once forecast to be a force 4 or 5, lost strength before it hit. And for now, the flood defences are holding up. Among those who stayed at home, we found no criticism of the authorities this time.
They did a great job. They got everybody out. The evacuation that happened, getting everybody out is the way that it should be. And I think that future storms, future threats like this is the way it should happen.
The evacuation turns out to have been more of a drill. And if it would have gone otherwise and it would have been a 4 or a 5, then that drill would have turned out to have saved lives.
The big problem now is getting everyone back home. 2 million people in all fled the storm. It will take some time. Matthew Price, BBC News, New Orleans.
Well, Hurricane Gustav has also cast its shadow over the Republican Party convention that's opened in St. Paul, Minnesota. Most of the first day's business was suspended, leaving delegates to deal with the news that the unmarried teenage daughter of the party's vice presidential candidate is about to have a baby. Well, for her part, Sarah Palin has publicly supported her daughter Bristol, underlining once again her strong anti-abortion view.
Now, as we have already heard, Hurricane Gustav is far less fierce than feared, but virtually all oil production and 82% of natural gas is still shut in the region. Oil majors were better prepared than in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina wrecked more than 100 oil platforms in the region and closed several refineries for months. Well, Gustav could still cause significant damage, but we won't know the extent until inspections have been done. If we look at oil prices on Monday, they did fall significantly. Today, they're still trading around $111 a barrel in Asian trading time. Well, I spoke to Paul O'Keefe earlier, a former loss adjuster who actually worked on the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I asked him if we can now breathe a sigh of relief.
I think certainly our worst fears have not been realised by Gustav. Onshore, I think the extent of devastation won't be anything like we saw in Katrina, but I would say there are still a number of fears remaining for the offshore element. Particularly Mississippi Canyon area does produce a large quantity of oil in the Gulf, and that will be a focus for the oil companies, and also the subsea pipeline network offshore.
Hurricane Gustav has weakened to a tropical storm, but it's been far from gentle, knocking over trees and power poles across the Gulf Coast and shutting down power to nearly 750,000 people in Louisiana and Mississippi. 7 deaths in the United States have been linked to Gustav. New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin says it's still too early for evacuees to return home because emergency workers need time to assess any damage. Well, we want to get the very latest now on Gustav. Jenny Harrison has that from the World Weather Center. Jen.
Monita, let me start out, as you see, with the very latest satellite image. This shows, obviously, the storm system moving on shore as it did several hours ago. Still some outer feeder bands here, actually, to come on shore. And, of course, there is a huge amount of rain still coming down from this storm system. But it has begun to ease off in the last few hours across the south. You can see here another band actually due to go through in the next couple of hours. But by far the worst of the rain, and now, of course, is moving further inland. Now, the storm continues to weaken. Right now, the winds are sustained just over 70 kilometres an hour. It's moving up to the northwest. It's still expected to stay at tropical storm strength for about the next 12 hours. Then later on today, it should actually become a tropical depression, but then it barely moves over the next couple of days. And so we're looking at some torrential amounts of rain. The accumulations, as you can see here, up to 400 millimetres of rain. So we're looking at some particularly heavy flooding rain, as I say, in the next couple of days. There are various flood warnings, watches, tornado watches, also tropical storm watches in place, as you can see. And then if we head further to the east, we're looking at Hurricane Hannah.